Hello and welcome to Atlantic Debrief, the Atlantic Council Europe Center's podcast on the most pressing issues impacting the transatlantic partnership today. My name is Jörn Fleck. I'm the Senior Director of the Europe Center here at the Council, and we're here to discuss today some of the ideas from our most recent report on transatlantic horizons, a collaborative US-EU policy agenda for 2025 and beyond. The report is really intended to set out a forward-looking policy agenda for the United States and its European partners under the next incoming US administration and the new European Commission, as we're seeing elections and leadership changes on both sides. To discuss an important memo as part of this report, my guest today is Ambassador John Herbst, the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, obviously a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, and one of the most active voices in making the case for why Ukraine's victory in its fight against Russia's unprovoked aggression is in the vital interests of the transatlantic partnership. Ambassador Herbst, John, a warm welcome to this debrief.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you, Jörn.
Ambassador Herbst wrote a section of our report on getting transatlantic coordination right for Ukraine, focusing on what the United States and the European Union and European allies more broadly do to support Ukraine's victory against Russia's full-scale invasion and to advance Ukraine's integration into the Euro-Atlantic frameworks and institutions. So to kick us off, Ambassador Herbst, perhaps let's say it's January 21st, 2025. You have a new U.S. administration. You have the new European Commission in office. Give us the sort of bottom line up front of your memo of what you would like to see the transatlantic partners achieve and drive forward together for Ukraine.
It's pretty simple. The greatest threat to European, transatlantic, and global security today is Putin's war full of war crimes on Ukraine. And it is the greatest threat because Putin's objectives are to go beyond Ukraine, to restore to a significant extent Moscow's control, or at least its influence, in the territories that once made up the former Soviet Union or the Russian Empire before it. That means he wants to upend the security arrangements made in Europe after the Cold War ended. And were he to succeed in Ukraine, he would definitely begin to work very hard to extend his control into NATO nations. He's having a hell of a time fighting a war in Ukraine because Ukraine is large, its people are resourceful, they are fighting for their existence as Ukrainians. While the same might be said regarding, for example, the Estonian people, their country, in other words, they would fight for their existence as Estonians if Russia were to invade. It would be much easier to defeat the small, flat country of Estonia compared to the large, geographically interesting territory of Ukraine. The smart place for us to stop Putin's ambitions is in Ukraine. All we need to do is arm and aid Ukraine sufficiently. That's the key. And while China is more dangerous ultimately than Russia, because China has a real economy, Russia's economy is third rate, the Chinese are watching very closely the United States and NATO and its response to Kremlin aggression. And if he sees that we let Putin win, when we as a collective are far stronger, and all we need to do is arm Ukraine and not be intimidated by Putin's nuclear bluster, he will draw very negative conclusions for our interests regarding Taiwan. So that's the key, no matter who's president come late January of next year.
Well, it's great to you set out the strategic imperative here and in your piece in the report. And you go through different areas of assessing of where transatlantic cooperation on support for Ukraine against that backdrop that you've just set out has worked well, and where there has to be change, and the United States and Europe have to have much space to step up. Can you take us a little bit through those different areas where you see, a strong cooperation having achieved good results for our interests as the transatlantic partnership and for Ukraine, and where you see the priority areas of the both sides of the Atlantic having to step up further?
On balance, the United States reaction to the Kremlin invasion, European reaction to the Kremlin invasion. When I say European, I'm referring to the EU, other European countries which are not part of the EU, most especially the UK, has been adequate to the task. And adequate is not high praise, but given the difficulty of the challenge, it's also not sharp criticism. It's been adequate because between the military aid we've provided, the economic aid we've provided, the sanctions on Russia, which have hurt their economy and their military-industrial complex in a notable way, the isolation of Russia, all of those things have prevented a Kremlin victory and imposed a high cost, though perhaps not as high as possible, on Moscow for launching this war. But the United States and its partners in Europe have also been too timid across the range of measures necessary to ensure a Kremlin defeat. That starts first and foremost with weapons supply and the use of weapons. And here the chief center lives in Washington. Since the United States obviously is the world's premier military as well as economic power, although I say the EU is clearly a completely pure economic power with the United States. If we made the right decisions on arms, our allies would follow. There's at least one other important European nation which shares in the timidity, the dangerous timidity of the Biden administration. That's, of course, Germany. It looks like Scholz and Biden are the Katzenjammer kids of the timid. And we see that especially on the issue right now of missiles, use of, in the case of Germany, sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine. In the case of the United States, permitting Ukraine to use ATACMS to fire into Russia. So we know the Brits, who provided Storm Shadows, are willing to allow that happen, but we are blocking the Brits too, because the Storm Shadows have some American components. So that's topic A, where we've done an adequate job, but we need to do more. Topic B refers to economic support. And here I have no complaints. I think both the United States and Europe have done a good deal. The U.S. less, especially given the currently fractious political conversation in the United States about aid to Ukraine. As we all know, there's a small portion of the Republican Party that believes we should cut off aid to Ukraine entirely, but especially economic aid. They've had outsized influence given their size, but not enough to actually impose their will. But I do think that even if American policy does not weaken, we may see less economic aid, partly due to the influence of that fraction. But overall, the economic support has been better than adequate, with one exception, where again I would use the word adequate. There's the issue of the Russian frozen state assets, not oligarch assets. Approximately $300 billion worth of such assets have been frozen in the international system. I think the boldest and the smartest thinkers are advocating the delivery of those assets, almost all of them or all of them, to Ukraine. There have been others also affected by Kremlin aggression who might deserve a fraction of that sum. But the international community has moved slowly towards that step. Now, point of fact, with the Biden administration in the lead, in fact, they deserve high praise for this. Basically, the G7, including the EU, have agreed to the notion of providing Ukraine this year, by the end of this year, which is not too long away, a $50 billion loan collateralized on the basis of those frozen Russian assets. That was a Biden achievement from, late spring. But the unfortunate thing here is that that late spring achievement has yet to be realized. And it's now at least 3 or 4 months since it was achieved. And here we're finding the green eyeshadow types in various finance ministries in the G7 are blocking this or stalling it. That needs to stop now. And the problem this time is not in Washington. It's in Paris. It's in Berlin. It's in Tokyo, maybe also in Rome. It needs to stop. So the Europeans have to step up. But more broadly, we have to go beyond that to the full solution advocated by people like Philip Zelikow and Bob Zoellick and Larry Summer, and hand over the whole kit and caboodle. And here, too, you have green eye shade type saying, well, you can't do that. This would undermine the financial system. I understand those arguments, but they don't seem to understand that we are in a crisis and that the dangers to the financial system, while not irrelevant and not null, are manageable. And I could go into that if you want, but I'm not sure if on a podcast of this length we need to do that. And the challenges to global stability, not just European stability, not just transatlantic stability, of a Putin win in Ukraine are vast. Therefore, we need to move on this. I think those are the main. Oh, excuse me, one more thing. We have done, on balance, not just an adequate job, I would say a solid job on sanctions. But a lot of countries the Russians and their allies, or allies is too strong a word, their partners like in China, like in India, like in Central Asia, are averting some of these sanctions. They're buying products which are forbidden to them via third-party markets. Secondary sanctions need to be strengthened greatly. They need to be imposed, especially on China and India, and on the countries through which this moves, like Kyrgyzstan, maybe other Central Asian countries. Once you sanction one or two major firms or institutions in one of those countries, I think the rest of them will get the idea. This step needs to be done.
Well, thank you. That sets out quite the agenda for the United States and Europe. And we will obviously, in your work and at the Council more broadly, will continue to follow these conversations and debates on the military assistance and restrictions, sanctions enforcement, and everything around the immobilized assets, state assets of Russia. I want to, as we're coming up against time, I want to go to two more questions, Ambassador, and ask you first. You do a great job in your piece, and you've already hinted at it in your earlier answer, at looking at some of the political dynamics. Obviously, assistance to Ukraine, support for Ukraine has become, well, not hostage to, but certainly negatively impacted by the domestic politics of both on the U.S. side, but also in different European countries. So what are you watching out for there as we go through the next few months of transition on both sides on the political dynamics?
Well, first and foremost, my attention is on the United States. We know that there are very healthy instincts in the Republican Party. In fact, the strongest voices for a sound policy have come from the Republicans in the Senate, like Mitch McConnell and Matt Rich, John Thune, Daines, others. They've not been intimidated by Putin's nuclear bluster the way the Biden team has, and so they want to maintain the level of our support in terms of dollars, but they want to use it more boldly to enable a Ukrainian victory. We know in the Trump camp there are voices of appeasement, or they would object to that phrase, but they would essentially give Ukraine to Putin because they have no clue how dangerous Russia is to us. They don't seem to understand. It's never reflected in their remarks that Russia considers us its number one adversary. And those voices are reflected in the Trump team. His vice presidential candidate has said some truly naive things, stunningly naive things, especially for such a bright man, regarding Ukraine and Russia. His own son, his oldest son, Don Jr., same thing. His new supporter, the other junior, Robert Kennedy Jr., same thing. But we also know that there are very smart people, very sound statesmen in the Trump camp. I'm thinking especially of Robert O'Brien, his last national security advisor, and Mike Pompeo, his last Secretary of State. And we know they retain influence. So we don't know what a Trump administration would do. If it's a Trump administration, it runs like the Trump administration in term one, there'll be some ups and downs, but the overall policy will be sound. If it reflects the voices of the naives in the Republican Party and in his own campaign, U.S. policy could make Biden's policy look bold and strong. So that's Trump. Harris, we don't know precisely what she would do. So far, she and her team have been meticulous not to say anything suggesting they do things differently than Biden. That's, to me, discouraging because I think it's unlikely that she would be weaker than Biden. But it would be unfortunate. It would be unfortunate for the country if she was no stronger, because we have to stop being intimidated by Putin's nuclear bluffs. We've never done that before in 75 years of nuclear diplomacy. It's just outrageous and dangerous, not just for our interests in Europe, but also in the Far East. The Chinese are seeing us get intimidated by Putin, and they're drawing conclusions which work against our vital interests, just as Putin is drawing those same conclusions.
Thank you. And to wrap us up, we asked all of the authors of the different memos on U.S.-European cooperation in the different areas to give us some policy recommendations. Maybe give us your one or two most high priority ones. You've already hinted at them, but just to drive them home.
Oh, look, it's very simple. Lift all restrictions on Ukraine's use of weapons and send them far more sophisticated weapons. That's one. Two, deliver those frozen Russian assets to Ukraine quickly. Three, make sure we're securing Ukraine's electric grids for the winter. And here the EU is doing great work, and so is Washington. And four, because Germany would like to retain the ability to renew Nord Stream 2, kill Nord Stream 2 forever. Germany should stop telling the Biden administration to kill an effort to renew the Nord Stream 2 sanctions. The Biden administration should stop appeasing Scholz and thereby Russia, and let those sanctions die in the U.S. Congress. Let those sanctions, that project, die in the U.S. Congress.
All right. On that note, Ambassador, thank you so much for a great piece. I encourage, and for a great conversation just now. I encourage all of our viewers to check out the report and the specific memo by Ambassador Herbst on Ukraine. That's all we have time for right now. Watch out for Atlantic Council, Eurasia Center, Europe Center, and much more from our colleagues on many of the issues we discussed today. Thank you again, Ambassador Herbst, and see you all soon.
Thank you. You're a pleasure.